Regardless of what you write, one of the most necessary skills that you should have in your day-to-day motorcycling adventures is the ability to adjust your own drive chain. So we have a look at this here, and it's getting pretty slack. It's really getting there. If the drive chain becomes too slack, it can actually just fling off. It will just eventually you'll go around a corner or something like that, and the weight of the chain will cause it to come off the rear sprocket or the front sprocket, and it gets kind of messy. So definitely a skill that everybody should have. Your chain will require periodic readjustment every 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 kilometres. It depends on what sort of chain you have. If you have a better chain, like an O-ring chain, you're probably going to be at the upper end of the scale. They don't stretch too much, so maybe 4,000 or 5,000 Ks. On the other hand, if you've still got the factory chain that your CB125E as an example left the factory with, then it's not going to take too long before it requires adjustment. When the bike is new, there's going to be initial chain stretch as well. That's common, doesn't matter what sort of chain it is, it will stretch a little bit when it's new. Then it'll sort of settle down and then just require the occasional retensioning. So we're looking at the amount of slack that's in the chain there. Now, the front sprocket and the rear sprocket, you've got the length, the full length of the chain there between the two of them. So we're sort of checking the tension in the middle, and there should be about 20 millimetres of deflection there. So, and that's free deflection. By that I mean that you're not pushing hard, like we have maybe 50 millimetres of deflection there, and it's easy to move that chain. If you over tighten your chain, it will stretch it and it will create other problems too, like premature sprocket wear. The chain itself will wear much more rapidly. This is actually only the second chain that this bike's ever had. It went from a factory chain to this O-ring chain, and it has a selection of sprockets, so I can't really throw the sprockets into the equation, but the chain itself is still quite serviceable, and hopefully it turns out to be the same for you. When you do buy a chain, spend the extra money, get an O-ring chain, you'll love it. You'll just think it's the best thing ever. The chain is quite simple. Effectively, when you adjust the chain, what you're actually doing is using these adjusters, there's one on each side, to pull the wheel back. You can see that there is a slot on your swing arm, and the axle can actually be drawn through that slot and the wheel with it, and that will actually tighten up your chain. So the theory of it, pretty easy. When you do adjust your chain, there's an adjuster like this one on both sides of the bike. We'll look at the other one in a minute. If you only adjust it from the chain side, what you're really doing is stopping the wheel from being level and straight sort of thing. You're actually twisting it if you only adjust one side. So when you push your when your handlebars are pointed in the straight position, so you can travel in a straight line, because the back wheel is at an angle, you'll actually turn. So one of the joys that you'll actually get if you don't adjust the chain from both sides, if you don't adjust the entire wheel, you'll actually get some pretty crazy tyre wear characteristics in there as well. And it won't help the chain because the sprockets won't be square to each other either. You've got the front sprocket and the rear sprocket, and they like to be roughly aligned. There's a lot of movement in a chain, but there's only so much. So when you start getting extreme adjustments, that's when you start to see the unnormal tyre wear and the sprockets wearing out and the chain wearing out too quite rapidly. Looking at the adjuster itself, that is the adjuster, and you can actually see that the axle goes through the middle of it. And as I said several times now, bear in mind that there's one of these adjusters on both sides. It has a locking nut and it has the adjusting nut. On the swing arm, there are some, I'll get out of the light, there are a series of marks. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And to align the wheel within the swing arm, all you need to do is make sure that that edge of the adjuster on there, say for example that is on the 6th mark, then on the other side you just need to make sure that that corresponding edge of its adjuster is also on the 6th mark. Pretty straightforward. So what we need to do is start by loosening the axle bolt. So let's jump in and do that. A sneaky view going on here, sort of sneaking a view past the exhaust pipe. We've got the bike on the centre stand. So enough said about that. I'm sure you guys are familiar with your centre stand now. Now, with a 22mm spanner, all you need to do is loosen the axle bolt off. Just loosen it so that that turns readily. Doesn't even have to be all that loose. If you find that the whole axle is turning, just put a 17mm spanner on the other side and hold it, and then use the 22 to loosen off this side. As far as loosening off the adjusters are concerned, I'm only going to show you on this side because you get a better view on this side. The other side is exactly the same. So what we want to do is start by putting a 12mm spanner on the adjuster and putting a 10 on the lock nut and then loosening the lock nut. And I'll do that on the other side, and with a bit of luck you'll see my hands moving. And not much else on the other side. Okay, so it's locked. Unlocked, sorry. Now, while I'm adjusting the chain, I like to move the adjusters in a similar sort of a way as the chain tightens up. So for example, if I turn this side 2 turns, I'll turn the other side 2 turns as well. And that just keeps my wheel roughly square. So with the axle loosened off and the lock nuts loosened off on the adjusters, we can put a spanner on the adjuster and we're going to count. So that's half a turn, that's a full turn, 1.5 turns, 2 turns. And we're just going to check how our chain is. Still a little slack. 2.5 turns, 3 turns, and then I'll go to the other side and I'll move the nut the same amount. So that's half, 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3. Now, let's check our chain tension. That's pretty good. There's our 20 millimeters there. And that's 20 millimeters of free movement. I'm not pushing hard, I'm just putting the screwdriver under it and lifting it until it starts to firm up. So I'm pretty happy with that. What we'll do is we'll turn the adjuster nut, the lock nuts up against the adjusters, but we're not going to tighten them. And what we're going to do is have a look at the graduations on the side of the swing arm and compare them on both sides to make sure that the wheel is in the middle. So what have we got? We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then about 2 millimeters in there. Can you see that? We're on the other side now, and what we can see is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and it's exactly on the 6. We need to get our 2 millimeters. So I reckon we'll start with half a turn. And I believe we need to go just a little further. It is actually quite useful on this job to shine a torch, because it actually gets quite dark in there in the shadows. And that's pretty good. Yep, in fact that's spot on when I look from above. So, any more ceremony? Lock the locking nut. Now this doesn't have to be super tight, just nipped up enough so that nothing will move. And the same on the sprocket side. That's beautiful. Finally, tighten up the axle again. Now this doesn't have to be super tight, just firm. There we go. Now that's your chain adjusted. However, there is another thing to bear in mind, particularly if you haven't adjusted your chain for a long time, and that's the adjustment of your rear brake if you have drum brakes. If you have a look, and we press our brake pedal, you can see that it's moving that arm there. That rod there goes all the way up to the brake pedal, and that's what makes it work. Now, it's actually easy to adjust, and adjusting the brake is a little bit of a personal preference as well. I like my brake to be with just a little bit of play there, so that I can rest my foot on that pedal but not immediately start applying the brakes. So there's just that little bit of movement there that you can see. That's quite a bit, but that's full braking there, so that's not a massive amount. When you're pressing that with your foot, not such a massive amount at all. Now, adjusting it is just done simply with this little nut here. Now that nut has a bevel on it, so when you rotate that nut you'll find that it'll go hard, then loose, then hard, then loose. That's perfectly normal and it's not broken. And what you need to do is just adjust that brake if it needs it to your satisfaction and make sure that the brake is not being applied. So you'll actually hear it if you apply the brake. I'll give you a demonstration of adjusting it, very straightforward. That became hard. And then I went loose again, and if you look you can actually see that that's moving. And that's as simple as that. If you turn that clockwise, you're making the brakes come on sooner. If you turn it anti-clockwise, you're releasing the brakes. When you've got your brakes to your satisfaction, just move your wheel and make sure that they aren't binding. You'll either that wheel will not turn, or you'll actually hear the brakes rubbing, and it will not turn as freely as this one is now. What you need to bear in mind as well is that as you ride, the brakes become hotter, and that a little bit of play there, that will actually reduce. Not a great deal, but if you get your brakes too tight, they might be loose when they're cold and they might be applying when they're warm. So that's just something to bear in mind. Other than that, this is how you adjust your chain, and this holds true for most bikes. There is a similar mechanism on most bikes for adjusting a chain, or even a belt if you've got a belt driven bike. They are out there. Similar sort of thing, adjusters, around 20mm of slack, and loosening off the axle bolt. Too easy.